Some people leave without moving. There's a particular kind of ending that never announces itself. No argument, no final conversation. Just a slow, steady withdrawal that happens so gradually, the mind struggles to pinpoint when it actually began. This is where relationship psychology becomes less about what's spoken and more about what's withheld. The emotional behavior shifts, not dramatically but persistently, and the person on the receiving end is left analyzing patterns instead of words, scanning for meaning in delays, in tone, in the growing space between responses. Attachment patterns are designed to seek closeness, to restore connection when it weakens. But what happens when the other person stops participating in that process entirely, without ever saying so? The psychological dynamics of a relationship can communicate more through silence than through language. Emotional distance doesn't always present itself as conflict. Sometimes it arrives as neutrality, as restraint, as presence that's technically there but functionally absent. This isn't about misunderstanding or miscommunication. It's about behavior analysis, observing what someone does, how often they do it, and what they consistently choose not to do. When emotional withdrawal becomes a pattern rather than an isolated event, it tells a story. And that story, whether or not it's ever verbalized, shapes the entire trajectory of the connection. The question isn't whether something changed. It's whether it will ever be named. What makes this psychological process so disorienting is that it operates beneath the surface of daily interaction. Conversations still happen. Routines continue. On the outside, the relationship patterns may look intact, but internally, something fundamental has shifted. The emotional behavior no longer carries the same weight. The presence no longer feels mutual. And the person experiencing this begins a quiet, often invisible investigation. Not because they want to, but because clarity is no longer being offered. They're left to interpret emotional distance on their own, to make sense of behavior that doesn't align with words, to sit with the growing realization that what's happening isn't being discussed because the other person has already decided it doesn't need to be. This is an analysis of what remains when explanations never arrive. Not a guide. Not a strategy. Just an observation of how psychological dynamics unfold when one person begins to leave before they're actually gone. It's about the subtle markers that appear first, the way patterns reveal themselves over time, and the internal clarity that eventually forms. Not from conversation, but from watching behavior repeat until it can no longer be denied. Because sometimes, the most honest communication happens in what's never said. There's a change that enters quietly. It doesn't announce itself with confrontation or visible rupture. Instead, it lives in the texture of how words are delivered, slightly flatter, just a degree cooler. The shift in tone happens before the mind registers it as something worth naming. It exists in the gap between what was said and how it felt to hear it. This is where relationship psychology begins to operate beneath conscious awareness. The emotional behavior hasn't collapsed, but something inside the rhythm has bent. And because nothing overtly wrong has occurred, the instinct is to continue as though everything remains intact. But tone is not neutral. It carries psychological dynamics that the body reads before the brain translates them into language. A response that once held warmth now arrives with restraint. Not hostility, just less presence. The absence isn't loud enough to justify concern, yet it registers in the nervous system as a way disturbance and emotional distance. Attachment patterns are wired to detect these shifts. even when the conscious mind dismisses them. The person on the receiving end may not yet ask questions, but internally, something has already begun to adjust. The emotional withdrawal is barely perceptible, but it's there, shaping the next interaction before it even begins. What makes this stage so psychologically disorienting is that behavior analysis would find nothing definitive to hold on to. There's no clear evidence, no singular moment to point toward. Just a slow thinning of emotional texture that can't quite be named. The relationship patterns haven't visibly changed. Conversations still happen. Routines remain. But the undertone has. And because explanations haven't been requested yet, none are given. The silence around the shift becomes its own kind of communication. It suggests that whatever is happening doesn't require words. Or perhaps that words wouldn't change it. This is the point where the mind begins scanning without realizing it. Replaying recent exchanges, searching for what might have been missed. The person starts to observe their own reactions more closely, wondering if they're reading too much into small things. But the body doesn't lie about emotional behavior. It knows when the ground has shifted, even slightly. And as tone continues to drift further from its original register, the question starts forming in the background. Not yet spoken, but growing. What just changed? The answer, for now, stays out of reach. What begins as a single instance of unclarity soon becomes a pattern, though it still doesn't register as one. A question goes unanswered, or the answer arrives vague enough to require follow-up that never quite happens. The absence of clarification doesn't feel hostile. It feels like oversight, like timing, like distraction. So it's absorbed without resistance. Relationship psychology teaches that humans are wired to fill gaps with the most generous interpretation available, especially when attachment patterns are still active. The mind offers explanations on behalf of the other person. They're busy, they're tired, they didn't see the message. These internal narratives protect against the discomfort of considering that the absence might be intentional. But repetition changes meaning. When clarification is withheld once, it's an accident. When it happens again, it's still explainable. By the third or fourth time, the behavior analysis shifts, not consciously, but structurally. The emotional behavior of the other person starts to communicate something beyond their words. What they don't say becomes as significant as what they do. The psychological dynamics between two people begin to operate on a new frequency, one where gaps are no longer filled in automatically. The person waiting for clarity starts to notice the weight of what isn't being offered. Emotional distance grows not through conflict, but through the accumulation of things left unaddressed. The absence doesn't announce itself as rejection. It presents as neutral space, as nothing in particular. And because there's no visible emotional withdrawal, no clear moment of refusal, the mind struggles to categorize it as a problem. Relationship patterns are built on reciprocity, on the assumption that when something is unclear, both people work toward understanding. But when one side stops participating in that process, the dynamic becomes unbalanced. The other person begins carrying the interpretive load alone, translating silence into meaning, searching for answers that aren't being provided. This is where communication breakdown begins. Not with an argument, but with the quiet refusal to clarify what's happening. Still, concern hasn't fully arrived. There's a lingering belief that things will eventually realign, that whatever is causing the fog will lift on its own. The emotional triggers haven't been sharp enough to provoke confrontation. Instead, there's a low hum of uncertainty that runs beneath daily interactions, never quite loud enough to demand attention. But it's there, shaping how the next conversation will feel, how the next silence will be interpreted. The absence of clarification is starting to teach the nervous system a new lesson, that answers may not come, even when they're needed. And that realization, still forming, begins to alter everything. Time starts behaving differently. A message that used to receive a reply within minutes now sits for hours, sometimes longer. The delay isn't extreme. It doesn't cross into ghosting or obvious neglect, but it's consistent enough to notice. Responses arrive softer, shorter, less engaged. Where there was once elaboration, now there are confirmations. Where there was once curiosity, now there's politeness. The shift is subtle, but the emotional behavior beneath it is clear. Investment is declining. Attachment patterns begin to register this as a threat, even when the conscious mind refuses to name it as such. The body knows what the brain hasn't yet accepted. That presence is being withdrawn in increments too small to justify alarm. Softened responses carry a particular psychological weight. They don't reject outright, but they don't invite continuation either. They close loops without opening new ones. This is a form of emotional distance that operates through restraint rather than absence. The other person is still there, technically available, but the texture of their engagement has changed. Relationship psychology reveals that this kind of behavior analysis requires attention to rhythm, not just content. It's not what's being said, it's how long it takes to say it, how much energy is behind it, how much space is left for the other person to exist inside the exchange. When that space begins to narrow, the psychological dynamics shift from reciprocal to one-sided. The person on the receiving end starts adjusting their own behavior in response. They may begin timing their messages differently, waiting longer to avoid seeming too eager. They might soften their own tone to match what's being reflected back. This is where relationship patterns begin to erode, not through conflict, but through gradual disengagement that both people participate in, often without realizing it. The delays and restraint become normalized, absorbed into the daily rhythm of interaction. What once would have felt strange now feels like the new baseline. And because there's still contact, still some form of connection, it's easy to tell oneself that nothing fundamental has changed. But something has. The emotional withdrawal isn't dramatic, but it's measurable. The distance isn't declared, but it's felt. And as small delays continue to accumulate, they begin forming a larger picture. One that doesn't require explanation because it's written in behavior. The mind starts cataloging these moments, not actively, but instinctively. The nervous system is learning what to expect. Less immediacy, less warmth, less of the presence that used to define the connection. The question forming now isn't whether something has changed, it's whether it will ever be named. Consistency disappears, and in its place arrives something harder to read. One day the emotional behavior feels warm, almost like before. The next, it's distant again, cool and minimal. There's no clear pattern to predict which version will show up. This inconsistency is its own form of communication. Though it doesn't clarify anything, it only deepens confusion. Relationship psychology identifies this as one of the most destabilizing dynamics in human connection. Intermittent reinforcement. The emotional signals are mixed, neither fully present nor entirely gone, and the mind struggles to land on a stable interpretation. Attachment patterns are particularly vulnerable here, because the nervous system can't settle into a coherent response. It's caught between hope and withdrawal, unable to commit to either. The inconsistency makes behavior analysis nearly impossible from the inside. When someone is fully distant, the message is clear. When they're consistently engaged, the relationship patterns feel secure. But when presence flickers, available one moment, absent the next, it creates a psychological loop that's difficult to exit. The person receiving these signals begins scanning every interaction for clues, trying to determine which version is real. They start attributing meaning to timing, tone, word choice, response length. Every small gesture becomes evidence in an internal case they're building, even though they don't yet know what the verdict will be. The emotional distance isn't stable enough to mourn, but it's present enough to register as loss. This stage reveals something critical about psychological dynamics in relationships. People stay longest in situations they can't fully interpret. When the emotional behavior is clear, even if painful, decisions become possible. But when it shifts constantly, the mind stays engaged, searching for resolution. The person withdrawing may not be aware they're creating this effect. They may believe they're simply navigating their own uncertainty, showing up when they can, pulling back when they need space. But the impact on the other person is profound. The inconsistency trains them to stay alert, to monitor every fluctuation, to never fully relax into the connection or fully release it. It keeps them suspended in a state of waiting, where neither presence nor absence feels permanent. What's left is a relationship that exists in fragments. Moments of closeness that briefly restore faith, followed by stretches of distance that quietly erode it. The emotional withdrawal isn't total, so it doesn't demand confrontation. But it's frequent enough that the connection can't stabilize. And as the pattern repeats, the person on the receiving end begins to realize something uncomfortable. They're not waiting for things to get better. They're waiting to understand what's already happening. The emotional triggers haven't been sharp, but they've been constant. And that constancy, paradoxically, is what makes the situation so hard to leave. The mind becomes its own interrogation room. Every small exchange is replayed, examined for hidden signals. A short text, a delayed response, a neutral tone. All of it gets analyzed for what it might mean beneath the surface. This is where relationship psychology enters a hyper-vigilant phase. The person begins searching for clarity in places it was never meant to exist. Ordinary interactions, once taken at face value, now carry the weight of interpretation. The emotional behavior of the other person hasn't clarified, so the observer compensates by overanalyzing. This isn't paranoia. It's the mind's attempt to restore predictability in a dynamic that has quietly destabilized. Attachment patterns demand coherence, and when it's not provided externally, the nervous system tries to construct it internally. The internal questioning doesn't stay contained. It begins to color perception across the entire relationship. A casual comment gets scanned for double meaning. A pause in conversation feels loaded. The absence of affection, even in neutral moments, starts to register as evidence of something deeper. Psychological dynamics shift from trust-based to evidence-based. The person is no longer assuming goodwill. They're checking for it, moment by moment. This creates an exhausting internal loop, where nothing feels neutral anymore. Every interaction becomes a test, even though no one agreed to that framework. The behavior analysis happening in the background is relentless. but it's also mostly invisible. On the surface, things may still look functional. Underneath, the relationship patterns are fracturing. What makes this stage particularly isolating is that the questioning stays internal. The person doing the analysis often doesn't voice what they're thinking, because they're not sure if their observations are valid. They worry they're reading too much into things, that they're creating problems where none exist. So they stay quiet, continuing to search for meaning in silence. But the longer this goes on, the more the emotional distance becomes undeniable. The relationship isn't falling apart loudly. It's eroding in the margins, in the small moments that don't feel significant enough to address. The emotional withdrawal is subtle, but it's shaping everything. And the person experiencing it is left trying to make sense of it alone. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being in a connection where nothing is technically wrong, but nothing feels right either. The psychological dynamics have shifted, but there's no language for it yet. The internal questioning grows heavier, more persistent, more difficult to dismiss. The person begins to wonder if they're the only one noticing the change, or if the other person sees it too and simply isn't saying. Either possibility feels destabilizing. And as the search for meaning continues, the questions themselves start to matter less than the fact that they exist at all. Because in a healthy dynamic, clarity doesn't require investigation. It's given freely. When it isn't, that absence becomes the answer. The first explanation the mind offers is almost always the kindest. Something external must be happening. Work stress, family issues, personal struggle. The emotional behavior doesn't feel permanent, so it's attributed to circumstances. Relationship psychology shows that people naturally resist interpreting distance as relational when attachment patterns are still engaged. The instinct is to protect the connection by framing the shift as temporary, as something outside the relationship rather than inside it. This interpretation provides psychological relief. It allows the person to stay without confronting the possibility that the dynamic itself has changed. The emotional distance is reframed as situational noise, not structural damage. This is where behavior analysis becomes distorted by hope. The mind selectively highlights moments that support the temporary cause narrative. A slightly warmer message, a brief return to familiarity, a moment where things feel almost normal again. Those fragments are held as evidence that the distance isn't real, or at least isn't lasting. The psychological dynamics here are protective. They allow the person to stay emotionally invested without facing the discomfort of what's actually unfolding. The relationship patterns haven't visibly collapsed, so it's easier to believe they're intact. The person tells themselves, "This is just a phase. Once things settle, it'll go back to how it was." And in that belief, they find temporary stability. But situational explanations only hold for so long. When weeks pass and the distance doesn't lift, the narrative starts to crack. The emotional withdrawal remains, even when the supposed external stressors change or resolve. The tone doesn't warm. The engagement doesn't return. And slowly, the person begins to realize that the cause they've been attributing the distance to may not be the real one. This is a painful cognitive shift. It requires letting go of the protective interpretation and considering that the distance might be relational, not situational. That the other person may have simply pulled back, not because of life circumstances, but because something inside the connection has shifted for them. Still, even as this realization begins to form, it's resisted. The mind searches for new situational explanations, new temporary causes to hold on to. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they need space, but don't know how to ask for it. Maybe once they feel better, things will realign. These interpretations aren't entirely wrong. They may even contain pieces of truth, but they're incomplete. Because what they avoid addressing is the behavior itself. The pattern of withdrawal, the lack of transparency, the absence of effort to reconnect. The psychological dynamics have already spoken. The relationship patterns have already shifted. And the person watching it happen is slowly learning that sometimes distance doesn't need a reason beyond the fact that someone chose it. The shift from isolated incidents to visible pattern is where clarity starts to form. What once seemed like separate occurrences, a delayed text here, a flat tone there, a weekend of silence, begin to line up. The mind starts connecting dots it previously dismissed as unrelated. This is where relationship psychology becomes undeniable. The behavior isn't random. It's consistent. The emotional behavior has a shape now, a rhythm that repeats across weeks and contexts. Attachment patterns recognize this as a signal that can no longer be ignored. The nervous system, which had been scanning for coherence, finally finds it, but not in the way it wanted. The pattern isn't one of return. It's one of steady, quiet withdrawal. Behavior analysis becomes clearer when viewed longitudinally. A single moment of distance can be explained away, but when distance shows up across multiple situations, in different settings, with no clear external cause, it stops being situational. It becomes structural. The psychological dynamics of the relationship have shifted, and the pattern is the proof. The person begins to see it not just in what the other does, but in what they don't do. The absence of check-ins, the lack of curiosity, the minimal effort to maintain closeness. These aren't accidents, they're choices, even if unconscious ones. And recognizing that is where the emotional distance stops feeling ambiguous and starts feeling deliberate. This is also where the internal narrative begins to change. The person is no longer searching for explanations that justify the distance. They're recognizing the distance as the explanation itself. The relationship patterns have been speaking all along, through behavior, through silence, through the slow erosion of presence. And now, those patterns are undeniable. The emotional withdrawal isn't temporary. It's been happening for weeks, maybe longer. And the realization lands with a particular kind of weight. Not shock, but something quieter. A slow, uncomfortable knowing that's been building beneath the surface all along. The mind resisted it, explained it away, reframed it. But the body knew. What surfaces now isn't panic. It's clarity. The kind that doesn't require more evidence, more analysis, more time. The pattern has already told the story. The psychological dynamics have already revealed what words never did. And the person is left standing in the aftermath of their own understanding, realizing that they've been watching this unfold for longer than they wanted to admit. The question is no longer what's happening, it's what now. And that question, unlike the others, doesn't have a comforting answer. Because patterns don't reverse themselves through hope. They shift through action, or they don't shift at all. There's a point where distance stops feeling like a disruption and starts feeling like the norm. The emotional behavior that once caused internal questioning now simply is. The nervous system, after weeks of vigilance, begins to adapt. Not because the situation has improved, but because the mind can't sustain high alert indefinitely. Relationship psychology reveals that humans have a profound capacity to normalize what repeats. The psychological dynamics recalibrate around the new baseline, even when that baseline is defined by absence. What once triggered anxiety now passes without much reaction. The emotional distance has become so familiar that its presence, or rather, its persistence, no longer shocks the system. This adaptation is not the same as acceptance. It's closer to resignation, though even that word feels too active. The person isn't choosing to be okay with the distance. They're simply running out of emotional resources to resist it. Attachment patterns, which initially fought to restore closeness, begin to quiet. The behavior analysis that once consumed mental energy starts to fade into background noise. The person stops asking why. They stop searching for meaning in every interaction. Not because they found answers, but because the lack of answers has become predictable. The relationship patterns have settled into a rhythm of low engagement, and the mind has learned to function within that rhythm, however uncomfortable it may be. What makes this stage particularly insidious is that it can be mistaken for stability. On the surface, things may appear less turbulent. There are fewer emotional triggers, less internal chaos, fewer nights spent replaying conversations. But this isn't healing. It's accommodation. The emotional withdrawal hasn't reversed. The psychological dynamics haven't improved. The person has simply stopped expecting them to. And in that shift, something critical is lost. The ability to recognize the relationship for what it's become. The distance is no longer alarming because it's no longer surprising. It's just how things are now. And that familiarity, more than the distance itself, is what solidifies the disconnection. There's a quiet danger in becoming used to less. It creates a false sense of equilibrium, where the relationship continues to exist in form but is hollowed out in substance. The person may still be present in daily routines, still exchanging words, still sharing space. But the emotional behavior between them has fundamentally changed. And because the change happened gradually, without a single breaking point, it's easier to stay than to leave. The mind has adapted. The nervous system has recalibrated. And the relationship patterns, now defined by distance rather than closeness, continue. Not because they're working, but because they've become too familiar to disrupt. The moment clarity arrives, it doesn't come from a conversation or a confession. It comes from within, built slowly over weeks of observation, pattern recognition, and silent understanding. The person realizes they no longer need the other to explain what's happening. They already know. The emotional behavior has communicated everything. The psychological dynamics have been transparent all along, even when words weren't. Relationship psychology teaches that behavior is the most reliable form of truth. And now, after watching the same patterns repeat across contexts and time, the internal picture is complete. The attachment patterns that once fought for closeness have finally accepted what the evidence has been showing. The other person has already left, even if they haven't said so. This clarity is not satisfying. It doesn't bring relief or resolution. It simply is. A hard, quiet knowing that can't be undone. The person understands now that the emotional distance wasn't situational, wasn't temporary, wasn't something they could fix by being more patient or more understanding. It was a choice, even if an unconscious one. The emotional withdrawal was real. The lack of engagement was intentional, or at minimum, not worth fighting against. The behavior analysis that consumed so much mental energy has finally converged into a single conclusion. This connection is no longer mutual, and that realization, however painful, carries a strange kind of stability. Because uncertainty is harder to bear than painful truth. What's striking about this stage is how little external validation the clarity requires. The person doesn't need the other to admit they've pulled away. They don't need an explanation or an apology. The psychological dynamics have already spoken. The relationship patterns have already revealed the truth. The person has watched it unfold in real time, in dozens of small moments that added up to something undeniable. And now, standing on the other side of that observation, they possess a kind of knowledge that doesn't need confirmation. It's self-evident. It's lived. It's written in the behavior that's been unfolding all along, waiting to be read. This is where the internal and external narratives diverge. Externally, the relationship may still look intact. There may still be contact, still some version of interaction, still the illusion of continuity. But internally, the person has already crossed a threshold. They've moved from confusion to clarity, from hope to understanding. And that shift, once it happens, is irreversible. The emotional behavior they've been tracking has taught them something foundational: that presence and absence can coexist in the same relationship. That someone can still be there, technically, while being entirely gone. And that sometimes, the only confirmation you'll ever get is the one you give yourself. In the end, the relationship is remembered not for its conversations, but for its silences. Not for the explanations that came, but for the ones that never did. The emotional behavior that defined the final stretch wasn't dramatic. It was absent. The psychological dynamics weren't loud. They were muted, withheld, consistently unavailable. What remains in memory isn't anger or betrayal. It's the weight of unanswered questions. The slow accumulation of things that were never clarified, never addressed, never brought into the open. Relationship psychology reveals that this kind of ending, one defined by absence rather than confrontation, is often the hardest to process. Because there's nothing concrete to hold on to. Nothing to definitively point to as the moment it ended. It just faded. The person is left with a strange archive. Not of what happened, but of what didn't. The calls that weren't returned. The conversations that never deepened. The reassurances that were never offered. The emotional distance that was never named. These absences become the primary evidence of what the relationship became. And in their own way, they tell a clearer story than words ever could. Behavior analysis in hindsight was always more accurate than language. The attachment patterns knew before the mind did. The nervous system registered the truth before the heart was ready to accept it. What never arrived was, in fact, the most honest communication of all. There's a particular loneliness in being left without closure, without explanation, without even the dignity of a clear ending. The emotional withdrawal was real, but it was never formalized. The relationship patterns shifted, but they were never discussed. The person is left to carry the understanding alone, knowing what happened but having no external validation for it. And that absence of acknowledgement can feel like a second loss, not just of the relationship, but of the right to name what it became. The psychological dynamics have spoken, but only one person heard them. And that asymmetry, that imbalance of awareness, lingers long after the connection has dissolved. What remains, ultimately, is a lesson written in silence. That distance doesn't always announce itself. That endings don't always arrive with clarity. That sometimes, people leave without leaving, withdraw without explaining, vanish while still being visible. The emotional behavior was the message. The patterns were the truth. And the person who stayed long enough to see them is left with a kind of knowledge that's both painful and precise. They know how to read what isn't said. They've learned that absence is a language, and they understand now, in a way they didn't before, that what never arrives often speaks louder than anything that does. What's left at the end isn't confusion, it's clarity. The kind that doesn't need validation, doesn't require the other person to confirm what you already know. You've watched the patterns, you've read the behavior, you've sat with the silence long enough to understand that it was never temporary. The emotional withdrawal wasn't a phase. The distance wasn't situational. It was a choice, whether conscious or not. And that knowledge, however uncomfortable, is more solid than any explanation they could have given. Because people tell you who they are through what they do, not through what they say they'll do. And when presence becomes optional, when engagement becomes inconsistent, when closeness is no longer maintained, that's the message. You don't need them to spell it out. The relationship ended long before anyone said it did. Maybe it's still continuing in form, in routine, in the illusion of connection, but the substance left quietly, piece by piece, in all the moments that never arrived. And now you're standing on the other side of that realization, holding a truth that's entirely yours. No closure, no final conversation, just the weight of understanding what happened while it was happening. That's not weakness, that's awareness. And awareness, once it settles, doesn't fade. It just becomes part of how you see things now. If you want to keep learning how to read what people don't say, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. This is where we break down the psychology that lives beneath the surface. Before you go, if this resonated, you need to watch the previous video. The moment emotional distance became impossible to ignore. It covers the exact point where the shift stops being subtle and starts being undeniable. The moment your nervous system finally catches up to what your mind has been avoiding. That video will show you the psychological breaking point that happens right before everything I just described. You've already lived through this process. Now go back and see the moment it became real. Link is on screen. Don't skip it.